Welcome to Touching is Good. I'm Daniel, and this is the Nintendo DS. Just over 10 years ago, I went into my usual EB Games and picked up what would go on to become my favourite gaming system ever, the Nintendo DS. I can still remember when I first heard about the DS way back in early 2004. A handheld system with two screens? How the heck is that going to work? Even after the system reveal only a few months later at E3 2004, I still wasn't sure exactly what to make of it. The second screen on the bottom is going to be a touch screen, and there's a microphone. Okay, sure. Not really sure how that's going to work, but hey, there's a portable version of Super Mario Bros. 64, and being a Nintendo fan since pretty much forever, of course I was going to get one. What I didn't expect was just how much enjoyment I would get out of the system when all was said and done. The system came out first in America on November 21st, 2004, the first time any Nintendo system had launched in a region that wasn't Japan. A few weeks later, it came out in Japan on December the 22nd. Australia received it on February 24th, 2005, with Europe following on March the 11th. For all the main regions, barring Japan, a demo of the upcoming Metroid Prime Hunters game was included. To say the launch lineup was underwhelming, it's kind of an understatement. Sure, it had a pretty nifty version of Super Mario Bros. 64 and WarioWare Touch for all the non-American regions, but it was still one of the weakest launch lineups in recent memory. Even going beyond the launch, the first few months were kind of rough. It wasn't really until mid-2005 that decent software started to roll out for the system. By the end of its lifetime, the DS had an amazingly robust and full library with games that covered pretty much each and every gaming genre known. Fighting games, racing games, puzzles, first-person shooters, survival horror, classic adventure games, 2D platformers, strategy games, scrolling shooters, sports games, rhythm games, and role-playing games of almost every variety. If there was a genre that you were into, the DS was almost guaranteed to have you covered. It still amazes me that a system everyone was ready to write off before it launched as the next Virtual Boy went on to become Nintendo's most successful system ever. Yet, it still kind of seems to be a system that doesn't get the respect it deserves from the gaming population as a whole. It still has the stigma of being just a handheld gaming machine and not a game system for serious gamers. When I look at it, I see a gaming system for everyone, and it always strikes me as odd that a lot of really good and amazing unique games just get ignored. Anyway, what I'm trying to get at here is that I love the DS. So, with all that said, that brings us to what this video is about. Welcome to Touching is Good. The aim of the series is to share my passion and love for the DS, and to hopefully introduce people to some games that they may never heard of before, and to show the DS was more than just the casual only gaming system that it seems to be labelled. Each episode I'll be looking at a game or a series of games, going through the basics of them and giving my opinion. So with the intro out of the way, the best place to start is with a game series that was so big at the time the DS launched, it was positioned as one of the big marquee series in the early life of the DS. It even had a demo included with many early units. I'm of course talking about Metroid. Now, to put things into context, Metroid was huge for Nintendo in the early 2000s. In late 2002, Nintendo released Metroid Prime for the GameCube and Metroid Fusion for the Game Boy Advance, both on the same day. Both games were incredibly well received, with Prime earning a good deal of Game of the Year awards. Nintendo was getting ready for another two Metroid games in 2004, Metroid Zero Mission, a remake of the original Metroid for the GBA, and Metroid Prime 2 Echoes for the GameCube. Come E3 2004, when Nintendo unveiled the DS, one of the first titles they showed for it was a new Metroid Prime Hunters. It's easy to see why Nintendo pushed Hunters hard in the early days of the DS. It graphically showed how much a step up the system was from the GBA, and it also showed that even though the system wasn't as powerful as the PSP, which launched roughly around the same time, it could pump out some nice looking visuals if the effort was put in. It also showed how a first-person shooter, a genre that was really exploding at the time, could work on the new system. First-person shooters up until the DS weren't really a genre you'd associate with handheld systems. A few had come out on the GBA, heck even the Game Boy had Faceball 2000, but they all played kind of clunky and not as smooth as people had gotten used to. Even though the original Metroid Prime wasn't really a true FPS, it's more of a first-person adventure, it was a series Nintendo had that could easily translate into one, unless of course you count Geist, which most people probably don't. Another thing that was worth noting is that the DS came out just 1 week after the launch of Metroid Prime 2 in the US. So Nintendo was really banking a lot on Metroid at the time to be the series to really help them get a bigger grip on the more traditional gamers. Kind of strikes me as funny that in one generation we went from Metroid being almost the saviour of Nintendo to kind of another footnote after what happened with Metroid Other M. Anyway, enough of that. How does the game play? The controls are pretty simple. You use the face button to control movement and stylus to control the aiming. Firing is handled with either shoulder button, yay for lefties, and jumping was performed by simply tapping on the screen. To change weapons or activate Morph Ball mode, you simply press the corresponding icon on the bottom screen. If I had one gripe about the controls, it's that jumping controlled by tapping the bottom screen is a little bit, not as precise as it could have been, and it did cause me a few issues in the main game. There is an alternate mode in the game to switch the jumping and shooting, and while this does feel more precise, movement feels off. Oh, and if you wish, you can have all the movement done by the face buttons, D-pad for movement, A, B, X, Y for camera, and vice versa, but this doesn't feel very natural. The top screen shows your standard first-person view, taking many details from the first Metroid Prime. Bottom screen displays your map, as well as some action icons for activating morph balls and missiles. This gameplay on one screen and map on the other would become a staple for a lot of DS games. However, it's not something that would entirely cross over to the full game. I'll get more into that later. Graphically, the demo looks great, really shows how much a step up the DS is from the GBA. Even looks better than some of the better looking Nintendo 64 SPS games. In the demo, you have 3 single-player modes to play through. The first one, called Training, sees you navigate Samus for a series of rooms. In each room, you have to kill all the enemies in order to proceed to the next one. After you've cleared a few rooms and then navigated a Morph Ball maze, you face off against the Samus clone, after which the mode ends. The other modes are Survivor and Morph Ball. Survivor gives you a large arena to run around in and kill enemies to try and earn a high score, and Morph Ball is a race against the clock to try and get to the end. Also included is a multiplayer mode, which you can connect to wirelessly with some friends to play some local deathmatch rounds. If you're playing on your own, you can get around a good 20 to 30 minutes out of the demo if you want, more if you have friends, each with a copy of the demo. No single card multiplayer here, unfortunately. The demo does its job well, gives you the basic understanding of how the main game is going to play, and shows off the capabilities of the system quite well. It was a pretty awesome teaser for the full game. However, we would have to wait a while before we could get our hands on the full title, as it was delayed several times. It wouldn't end up coming out until March 2006, so Nintendo could add online play to the title, something that wasn't originally planned to be part of the game. However, Metroid fans wouldn't have to wait long to get their hands on some Metroid action on the DS, although it may not have been exactly the Metroid game they were looking for. So I originally overlooked Metroid Prime Pinball at the time of its release. I wasn't really the biggest Metroid fan in the past. It's only been the last few years. The series has really clicked with me, and now I totally get why it's amazing. And on the recommendation of some people online, I got around to picking this up, and wow, it's a really good game. I should note that I've always been into pinball games. Revenge of the Gator on the Game Boy is one of my favourite Game Boy games. And of course, the usual Microsoft Pinball and all that sort of stuff. Over the years, Nintendo has published a handful of pinball games, starting with Pinball on the NES. For Metroid Prime Pinball, though, they went with developer Fuse Games, who they'd previously gotten to work on Mario Pinball Land for the Game Boy Advance. On a base level, Prime Pinball is Shock-Aro pinball game. Instead of having a usual metal ball to fire around the screen, you have Samus in a Morph Ball mode. However, all the usual pinball stylings are present: bumpers, flippers, ramps, spinners, and so on. To spice things up a bit, most stages will feature enemies floating around the table, such as Metroids or Space Pirates. You can also activate some mini-games that will require you to complete objectives within a certain time frame. Some of these mini-games will make Samus transform out of her Morph Ball mode and activate a mode where she's at the bottom of the screen, and you need to shoot down various critters coming towards you. Controls are simple and what you would expect: L and R for the flippers. You can also touch the bottom screen to bump the table. And Samus can drop bombs, which can be used to attack creatures nearby if you time it right. The big difference this game has with other more traditional pinball games is that instead of just having several different themed tables based on the Metroid series, Prime Pinball gives you a series of tables that are all linked. After completing some objectives on the table you're on at the moment, you can unlock the ability to transport yourself to another table. The two main tables, though, are Pirate Frigate and Talon Overworld, and once you complete the objectives on either of those tables, you have the chance to travel to 2 other tables, Phandrana Drifts and Phazon Mines, each of which has a large boss unit you must defeat to move on to the next table. Completing objectives on any of the 4 tables will give you a Chozo artifact, and once you collect 12 of these, it's on to the Artifact Temple, where upon completing that, you can go on to face Metroid Prime on the final single-player table, the Impact Crater. So all up, in the main single-player mode, you have 6 tables. While that does sound like a lot, only 2 of those feel like proper pinball tables: Talon Overworld and Pirate Frigate. The others are all themed around a boss you need to defeat or some other main objective. Pinball makes great use of the DS's screens, letting you see all the action at the same time. It even takes into account the space between the screens, in that you do notice a time difference between Samus leaving one screen and entering the other, which is great for helping you line up shots and get your timing right. While it's not pushing the DS to its limits graphically, the game looks great and is one of the prettier games on the DS. Sound-wise, it features tracks from Metroid Prime. Each table sounds like its corresponding zone for the main game, barring Pirate Frigate, which for some reason has the Metroid Brinstar theme from Smash Brothers. Everything sounds like it should. All the bumpers and flippers make those awesome sounds real-life pinball tables do. Final thing to note is that the game came released with the DS Rumble Pack. The Rumble Pack would plug into the DS's GBA slot and provide exactly what it suggested. I don't have any experience with the Rumble Pack outside of using it for Space Invaders Extreme, but honestly I found it really noisy and it didn't add much. As a pinball game, it's great, and giving you an end goal that's more than just the highest score possible is great. If you're a pinball traditionist, each of the tables gives you the options to play it again in a high score classic pinball mode once you've unlocked them in the main mode. It might not be the Metroid game people wanted at the time, but it's an awesome game and maybe the best pinball game to grace a Nintendo handheld. The developer Fuse Games did go on to make another pinball game for the DS, Pinball Pulse: The Ancient's Beacon, which came out digitally on the DSi in 2009. So after several delays, Metroid Prime Hunters was finally released in early 2006. As I said before, it was delayed to add online to it. It was originally intended to just be a 4-player local-only game. However, with the launch of the Nintendo Wi-Fi connection in November of 2005, it just made way too much sense for online to be added to the game. The developer Nintendo chose was Nintendo Software Technology, a studio that they set up in the late 1990s. Their previous games included Crystallis and Bionic Commando Elite Forces on the Game Boy Color, Wave Race Blue Storm and 1080 Avalanche for the GameCube, versions of Ridge Racer for the Nintendo 64 and DS, as well as versions of Puzzle League for the N64 and GameCube. They are most likely more known these days for their Mario vs. Donkey Kong games, the first of which they made for the Game Boy Advance. They've never been one of Nintendo's biggest studios, but one of the smaller, more reliable ones that pump out a decent stream of good software. Metroid Prime Hunters would easily be their most high-profile title. Hunters is set between the events of Metroid Prime and Metroid Prime Echoes. The Galactic Federation has sent Samus on a mission to investigate a message that is broadcasting from the Almbic cluster, promising the secret to ultimate power resides in the Almbic cluster. Several other forces are hot on the trail of this message, and it's up to Samus to find out what the message means before the others can. The other forces after the power are the various hunters Samus comes into contact with throughout the game. These are Sylux, Spire, Noxus, Kaden, Weevil, and Trace. Each of these rival bounty hunters is out for the ultimate power, and you, Samus, will encounter them several times throughout the game. At times they will just randomly appear, which adds a nice touch of unpredictability. Throughout the game you will need to travel to 4 worlds: the Celestial Archives, Alanos, Vesper Defense Outpost, and Architera. Throughout these worlds are scattered 8 octoliths, which are all defended by guardians that must be defeated so you can claim your prize and move on to the next one. After obtaining an octolith, you will in classic Metroid fashion have a countdown timer to make it back to your ship. If you fail, it's back to just after the guardian fight to try again. It's during these countdowns that the other hunters can sometimes appear, and it does add a nice touch of tension to the game. Sometimes you think you'll be able to make it, and then a hunter's there and it'll just make things a little bit more tense. Each of the planet will require at least 2 visits to collect all 8 of the octoliths. So the basic program of the game is land on a planet, unlock the portal to a boss fight, which requires you to solve a few basic Metroid Prime style puzzles, fight the boss, get off the planet, rinse and repeat until you've collected all 8 octoliths. Once you've collected all 8, a new planet will present itself, which leads to the final confrontation with the ultimate power. The only power-ups Samus acquires throughout the game are weapons, which, other than the obvious combat use, allow to open up certain locked doors that a missile and arm cannons can't. Other than that, there's none of the usual suit upgrades found in most Metroid games. As a result, it does make things feel a little bit more linear and forced. Like, you'll see a blue door and you'll know that you need to find whatever weapon you need to open that blue door. Control-wise, Hunters feels exactly like the demo, with 2 extra details. Firstly, Samus can now access a scan visor, which can be used to scan items and enemies, just like in the console Prime games. Also, scanning objects in the environment will give you a little bit of info about the world and clues as to what's happened to the ancient race who used to inhabit these worlds, and at times advise on how to proceed. The other change is that you can now change weapons on the bottom screen. Other than that, the controls feel pretty much the same as the demo. Annoying jumping still intact. Maybe it's just me, but a few times I did have issues with platforming. Some of the areas have bottomless pits that make a few mistimed jumps result in death and restarting at the nearest checkpoint. Another change to the demo is that the bottom screen no longer shows a mini-map, it's now just a radar of possible enemies around. I found this more or less useless, and I think it would have been better to keep the map, although given how the areas are now more three-dimensional than in the demo, I guess it would be a bit hard to do that. Although the map can now be found by just accessing the pause menu. A big issue with the controls is that they do cause your hand to cramp after a while. Holding the system in one hand and the stylus in the other isn't that comfortable for long gaming sessions. A similar problem would affect Kid Icarus Uprising on the 3DS a few years later. I do wish they had have included a lock-on option like the console primes had. At least in the single players, it would have made moving and aiming and strafing a little bit less of a stress on the hands. That said, at least with these controls you can be very precise, and if you're good enough you'll be pulling off headshots easily in no time. Each quest for an octalyph will begin the same. You will need to search for 2 keys to open up a portal. These keys are hidden throughout the world and require you to solve a few basic puzzles. A few times it will be to kill a certain amount of enemies to unlock the key. There's also a few pretty fun morph ball sequences that you'll need to move through. Those who have played the console Metroid Prime games will be totally familiar with these. A few of the puzzles I had a lot of fun with. It was almost scratching that Metroid Prime itch, yet not. I guess they were just trying to keep the game focused and streamlined. More designed for portable play. Boss fights after you've opened the portals are very repetitive, and I mean, there's only really 2 types of boss in this game, and they're just the same repeated, but made harder each time. And by the end of them, they just kind of feel like an endurance test. Wait for the boss to be vulnerable, get your attacks in, dodge until they're vulnerable again. I wouldn't have minded if there was only 1 or 2 like these, but all 8, it's a bit much. That said, the final showdown with the final boss was great and requires a bit of switching weapons and just doing different things. Last thing I want to say is that the game looks amazing. The DS wasn't even 2 years old, but this game really seemed to push it. Everything looks clean and smooth, and I couldn't see much in the way of fog or slowdown. I guess it helps that each area was small and they didn't try to go too overboard, but it's a very ambitious attempt at a handheld game in 2006. I feel Metroid Prime Hunters is a game that kind of doesn't know exactly what kind of game it wants to be. On one hand, it wants to be a traditional first-person shooter with a focus on the game being on combat and battling the hunters and moving from kill room to kill room. On the other hand, it feels like it wants to be its big brother console Metroid Prime games, and these worlds that you want to explore and puzzles to solve, and while you might think those 2 games could mesh very well together, it sort of misses the mark slightly. It's a really good game, but something about it just feels slightly off. It's like I'm looking at Metroid Prime, but I'm playing a Turok Dinosaur Hunter, if that makes sense. As a first-person shooter with Metroid Prime influences, it works great. However, if you're looking for a big console Prime style game, you'll be a little bit disappointed. One thing I've not mentioned is the online, and truth be told, I never got a chance to play it. Going back to me not really being that much into Metroid, it wasn't until very recently I got around to playing this, and by then the Nintendo Wi-Fi connection for the DS and Wii had been taken offline. Everything I've read about it is very positive, and maybe the best online deathmatch style game on the DS. You can still do local multiplayer if you get a chance, and it even supports single card download play, so only 1 copy of the game is needed. Also, there's an option to play against bots in multiplayer mode. You get the choice of 7 characters to play, Samus and 6 hunters. Each plays different, has different alt modes and weapons. There's 15 stages to play through and a whole host of play modes. It's really worth checking out if you're into it. It's just a shame that it's not something that can be played online anymore. So that's almost it for the Metroid on the DS. One more thing that's worth mentioning is Metroid Dread. Metroid Dread was another Metroid game that was apparently in development for the DS. Nintendo had even pegged it down to show it at E3 back in the mid-2000s. Not much is known about it, not even what kind of game it was. Yoshio Sakamoto, who was the director in all the non-Prime games, has confirmed that the game was in development at one point, but other than saying it didn't become Metroid Other M, nothing else has really been said on it. And with that, we reach the end of Metroid on the DS. I do find it funny that how, going into the DS generation, Metroid was such a huge part of Nintendo's strategy. But by the end of it, after the mixed reception of Other M and diminishing sales, the series feels more or less dead. In the almost 9 years since Hunters come out, there haven't been any new Metroid games for any Nintendo handheld systems. Although the legacy of Metroid games does continue with games like Monster Tale or the Castlevania games on the DS, or Batman Arkham Origins, Blackgate and Xenodrift on the 3DS, or countless other awesome Metroidvania games that have been made in recent memory. It's just a shame that the series that started it all isn't getting a chance to shine when the genre is kind of at its height. That said, the DS had 2 amazing Metroid games. They may not have been the Metroid games everyone wanted, but they were really good games and I suggest everyone check them out. And that brings to close the first episode of Touching is Good. I really hope I didn't go on too long. If you've got any feedback or suggestions, just leave them in the comments below and I'll see what I can do. Next episode hopefully should be in about 2 weeks, so until then, you can always check out the latest Australian Nintendo news and reviews over at www.vooks.net and check us out on Facebook. So until the next episode, I'll catch you later. Bye!